Thank you so much for coming to our ArtStop today. My name is Alexander Jarman, and I have the really fun job of running the public programs here at the museum. This is our ArtStop program, where we stop for 15 minutes just to talk about a couple of things that are on view right now. And today we're going to be talking about Auguste Rodin. We have three sculptures right here that we're going to talk about, but we're also going to get into his life a little bit. And I'll bounce around a little bit. I'll try and keep it chronological, but you know, when you start telling a really good story, sometimes you just lose yourself and then you have to go back. So we'll probably do a little of that too. But I wanted to start off here with where we are. So if you were to come up and look at the dates on these pieces, you'll see here, for instance, male torso, and it's circa 1880. So 1880, very important date for Rodin. That's really when it all starts for him. That's when things really turn around in the form of this amazing commission that he gets, which you guys already know is the Gates of Hell, yes, which includes the Thinker, absolutely. So that's really his big break. So like I said, this is a really fun story. That's where it starts to turn around, but there's tons of really great failure before that. Rodin is the son of a police detective in the local police force and a seamstress. Has a fairly working class upbringing. Tries to go to the Grande École, the big art school, gets into the Petite École, you know, pretty good, but he doesn't get into his first choice, and it's a school for decorative arts. Some of that might have had to do with the fact that he was a terrible student. Horrible grades, and that in part is due to his own physical ailment of nearsightedness. And we know now that he would say he couldn't see things on the board very well, so he didn't really keep up with the lessons that were going on that were being taught, and he found solace in what he could see, which is the paper right in front of him on his desk. And he started to use all of his class time to make doodles and sketches. And so maybe not a fierce academic specimen, but somebody who surely took to art very early on. So he gets into this really interesting school for decorative arts, and he also gets to study anatomy under a sculptor, Berrier, which I don't know where Dr. Plotek is. But Dr. Plotek is going to tell us more about in a subsequent ArtStop. But this is actually here in our permanent collection, right over in Gallery 18. So I'll pass this around, but go check out that sculpture afterwards. So one of Rodin's teachers right there. But times are tough for someone that graduates from this decorative arts school. When you get into the Grande École, there is sort of an assurance that you're going to have some commissions or you're going to have some work afterwards. And he kind of forfeits that by not getting into this school. However, silver lining, what really ends up working out for him in the end is that he escapes all of that neoclassic traditional education that is drilled into your head if you go to the Grande École. So he kind of escapes that, and when he gets out, he has a much different approach to the figure and to sculpture that perhaps he would not have had if he had had a different education. So he gets out of school. There's lots of events that make it really hard if you're an artist. It's already hard enough, obviously, to be an artist, but the Franco-Prussian War really messes with the economy a lot of France. He kind of becomes itinerant. He's working in France. He works some in Belgium as an assistant to a sculptor. He also gets to do some traveling. And he, of course, could have already seen Michelangelo's Dying Slave in the Louvre, right there in France, but he also goes to Italy, and he sees Michelangelo's works in person. So drawing your attention here to this first work, this male torso, what we can realize is this incredible initial fascination with the work of Michelangelo that he was obsessively drawing and sketching on these travels stays with him. really for the rest of his life. And whether or not you think there is a concrete stylistic link to Michelangelo, certainly this fascination in the human figure stays with him the rest of his life. And you can see here this male torso very much might remind us of something like Michelangelo's Dying Slave, and I'll pass this around. This is at the Louvre. It's always fun when we have visual aids. So he comes back from Belgium, and indeed his first sculpture that does get accepted to an official Paris salon, which I'll pass around here, was marred by controversy. Oh, good. Something to talk about. So it's kind of that adage, remember, that sometimes we talk about how any press is good press, even if it's bad press, it's good press. And so here the figure, which barely made it in, barely made it into the salon, received all this controversy because a lot of sculptors, critics, judges, even some from the public, accused him of just casting it from a live model and not actually sculpting the work himself. And there were investigations. They went and took photos of the model and compared them to the actual statue. But some of that came from the fact that it is a life-size statue. And so the next two that the artist does after that are slightly larger than life-size. He sort of didn't want to have that fiasco again. But he's totally acquitted by this committee of sculptors who agree, okay, he didn't just cast this from life. But again, this is a very complex character, and we'll get into a few more elements of his biography. But he just had controversy surrounding him his whole life, and brought it on himself somewhat. Going back to this moment in the early 1880s, 1880 is, again, our circa date. 1881 is when he receives this commission from the French government. And really this is key also to remember, that part of the reason for his success is that he does have some admirers in government that can dole out these official commissions to him. And so they give him a commission in the early 1880s for the Gates of Hell, and I'll pass this around, of course, as well. Now, when I say this is sort of the turning point, yes, it's a great commission for him. In truth, of course, many of us know that the Gates of Hell was never fully finished in his lifetime, and the museum for which these would have been the doors, the Decorative Arts Museum that this was commissioned for, also never came to fruition. But out of that spectacular failure, again, this theme throughout his life of failures turning into great things, out of that, we get so many wonderful sculptures from his career. So absolutely, the thinker comes from working on the Gates of Hell. Some of his other notable works, of course, the Kiss comes out of this. And when you look at the Gates of Hell, you may not see these sculptures. Many of them, of course, were scrapped from the final design or got changed significantly. But these were all works that he had intended for those gates, and then for some reason they didn't make it in the final cut, and he made them into individual works of art. So it's this one commission that will last him until he dies in 1917, will serve as this lasting source of inspiration and this big project for him. Here you also have the study for polemicists, and I also brought a picture. We have this study here, and I brought a little picture of the maquette. You can see it's on this little stool, how small that is, even smaller than this. And of course, there was a large-scale version of this as well. This is incredibly important for studying Rodin as well, to realize that he would make these works and then he would hold on to them. He would make these plaster casts and he would hold on to them and continue scaling them up into life-size or slightly larger than life-size statues, or shrink them down into maquettes, and so that you would actually see some of the same figures in different statues over and over again, sort of this recycling of figures, sort of this going back into, further mining a subject that he had been working with. So he goes back over and over and over again. And of course you can see in the statue the story of this work right here. Polemicists is this Cyclops, and he has a crush on a shepherdess. Sadly, she does not return his love. And so he finds this big, huge rock to hurl at the shepherdess's lover, crushing him, and she has to jump into the sea. And so the moment that you see he's got his knee up on his chest here, is the moment he's trying to break off this big rock that he's about to hurl at the lovers. Also want to get into a little more of his influences very quickly, and there's a lot written, especially a sort of official messaging coming out of places like the Rodin Museum of his relationships with different women. And Rose Beret is this woman that stays with him throughout his entire life. They actually get married the year before he dies, after being together basically their whole lives. But there's a very important woman, Camille Claudel, that also factors into his life. When he makes the Gates of Hell, it's not just a commission, Rodin, we like you, we want you to make these gates. It was known to the people giving the commission that basically what they were handing him was the ability to form a workshop. It's not just him working anymore. He's able to hire all kinds of assistants and has this whole workshop helping him to make these models for the Gates of Hell. One of these assistants is Camille Claudel. She's incredibly gifted, and he sets her to work specifically on the hands and the feet, what he considered to be some of the most difficult parts of the statue. She's incredibly adept at that. He also falls in love with her. They do have this back and forth relationship in terms of hot and cold, but certainly she wanted to have a legitimate marriage at one point to Rodin. He would never leave Rose. And what happens is Camille becomes pregnant. And as far as we can tell, it seems that Rodin was the one that really pushed the issue and forced her to have an unwanted abortion. After that point, what you hear is that she descends into madness and becomes clinically ill, and everyone in the world tried to help her, but she was past saving. What doesn't get talked about is that part with the abortion at all, which totally crushed her, and after that point, her and Rodin are never lovers again, although they do see each other over the years. So that part wasn't talked about. But also that her family commits her to an institution after she goes through this horrible bout of depression and destroys many of her own sculptures. She gets committed to an institution, and the doctors, as far as we can tell from all the records, repeatedly wrote her family that she should be released, but the family never came to pick her up, so she spends the rest of her life in that institution. Now, why is it important to go into that, besides the fact that it's not talked about that much, is we're talking about a person who not just helped Rodin on his sculptures, but actually inspired Rodin's sculptures through her own original work. She was a sculptor successful in her own right. And so what I'll pass around right now is this great comparison. You see Camille's sculpture right here, a young girl with a sheaf, and here, this is Rodin's sculpture for Galatea, who's part of this whole Polyphemus story right there. And Camille's was created before Rodin's. So when you see that comparison, it's obviously Rodin, and she always wrote, Camille always wrote to people when she was applying for sculptures, I'm a pupil of Rodin's. But what we can see is actually there was actually a reciprocal relationship occurring there, that it wasn't just Rodin teaching her, but that she was also teaching Rodin. And that's an important influence that's not as well published. Moving on over here to our last sculpture, we have Eve, and I'll also pass around a full-scale version, which is not entirely based on this Eve per se in terms of the final pose, but it's nice to see this this life-size Eve. This is at the Nasher Museum, and there's also a great close-up of it with raindrops on her, very poetic. And The work that we have here, though, kind of seems a little more fully realized than some of these fragments like the male torso. And these would have absolutely been the types of pieces that he was working on in terms of developing these gates of hell. There was originally supposed to be a life-size Adam and Eve on top of the gates of hell, and that didn't end up happening. But we can see here this maquette, really. I mean, this looks like it has sort of an architectural fragment encasing it, and we can see how he was starting to figure out how a figure would play in space sort of as a relief with something right behind it. I will say that this is an artist who was incredibly interested in his own legacy. When you think about his early failures, and in 1880 he finally receives his first commission from the government. 32 years later, in 1912, the Metropolitan Museum of Art opens up an entire gallery devoted nothing but to the work of Rodin. He's still alive at this point, will be for 5 more years, and one of the only ways that this gallery could even exist, because the Metropolitan had collected some of his work, was that he was willing to donate a lot of his work to the museum. He was interested in making this gallery happen out of his own interest in self-preservation and writing his legacy into the history of art. This you have to think about, the time frame. This was actually somewhat radical. Places like the Museum of Modern Art go on several decades later to start making the idea of an entire gallery, certainly the monograph of an artist as an exhibition, fairly commonplace. But not so much when this first gallery opens to, of all things, a living sculptor. And of course we can think about Philadelphia too, with the Rodin Museum that's in Philadelphia, as these two sites that prove that the East Coast, that the United States was very interested in this sculptor's work as well. And of course some of him have gone, some people have gone on, historians have gone on to say that he is, this father or grandfather of modern sculpture in the end. So quite a legacy indeed. These are, of course, these smaller scale works, but hopefully they do give you a sense of this intense modeling that went into all of his figures. Again, this is an artist who was rejected a lot of times because he imbued so much emotion into his figures, when the sort of official aesthetic of the day was to present these more monumental figures that did not possess so much emotion, things that you would put on a public square, which is totally opposite of what this artist does, again, because maybe he starts off in a different place than he would have if he were at the Grand École. So initial failures, of course, leading to great successes for this artist, and we're very happy to have these 3 works here. And like I said, they're very small, so I hope that you will come up after I'm done and actually take a closer look at them. I'm going to stick around if you have any questions, but right now, thank you so much for coming to the ArtStop. Appreciate it.